Hi, everyone. Let's see. Okay, if I could ask everybody to reconvene, we'll move on to the next stage of the evening's proceedings. It looks like people did substantial damage to the buffet, for which I thank you. That's how we like to see the English department's budget being used. And I grew up in a house where we used the phrase, there's not enough to save, and if there was too much left, I was gonna have real trouble. So anyway, I'm gonna hand things over now to Professor Maureen McDonald to introduce her capstone seminar.
Hello, I'm Dr. Maureen McDonald. I'm a professor in the English department and the director of Women's Gender Studies. I'm very pleased to welcome you all here and to present our Monstrous Women seminar. We live in a time of monsters. The monsters might look like us or people we've marginalized. They might be beasts, ghosts, demons, witches, or friends. And although monsters and monstrous women might make us uneasy, they are also fascinating because they embody borderline concepts and stalk the perimeter of what we define as normal or as human. These past 2 days have reminded us that whether women count in the national imagination is perhaps an unsettled question. Our class began with many questions this year, along with the premise that these fantastical monsters reveal a great deal about the culture that spawns them and ourselves. The Oxford English Dictionary tells us that monsters can be imaginary creatures that are large, ugly, and frightening, or extraordinarily good and successful people. I'm glad to have worked with 12 writers who fit the latter definition. They best know what it has taken them to arrive at this point. We each know best who has supported us, whether family, friends, fans, or well-wishers to get us here. And on my part for that, I'd like to thank Ms. Miranda Lau for all the work she's done for our department in these last few years. Thank you. And I trust my writers will let their family, friends, coworkers, friends, fans know the ways in which their support and their solidarity has made a difference. And I'd like to introduce you to my writers. They are Kylie Davey, Natalie Devon, Abby Dressler, Alexia Hansen, Sophia Henry, Bailey Hosko, Autumn Jackson, Julia Lamott, Amanda Randazzo, Jess Safiati, Emma Walton, and Jen Zuka. I've learned a lot about how my writers think about monstrous women and what those figures reveal about what we might publicly disparage or privately desire. I'm glad I learned a lot about my writers, their quirks, their ideas and creativity, and their willingness to engage with each other's writing under really remarkably hard circumstances at moments. We're about to see 3 writers present their work for the class, and they'll be glad to take your questions afterwards. Please join me in welcoming Natalie Devlin.
Thanks, Marco. Okay. Hello, everybody. My name is Natalie Devlin, and my capstone project is entitled A Systemic Epidemic of Failing Sisterhood, When American Women Suffer Patriarchal Oppression at the Hands of Other Women. So for this capstone project, I took an academic approach as opposed to the more creative approaches that you'll see later on from my classmates. And I largely draw upon feminist theory and new historicism. So I wanted to kind of pick out a couple sentences from my project that I think best sort of encapsulate what I've been working on to just kind of briefly sum it up. I talk about this tendency in American literature from the late 1800s through the early 1900s to kind of present women as contradictory to one another, I guess. And so I show how women are patriarchally socialized and therefore do not stand in sisterhood with one another. And drawing upon new historicism, I argue that this is a reflection of the realities within American society. So essentially, American women do not have these bonds of sisterhood, and that's why we're seeing the same occurring within literature. So more specifically to this presentation, I'm going to be talking about this need for inclusion in order for sisterhood to succeed. Women need to include all women, regardless of race, sexual orientation, etc., in order for sisterhood to succeed. So for this project, two of the primary texts that I utilized were The Yellow Wallpaper by Charlotte Perkins Gilman and Machinal by Sophie Treadwell. However, for the sake of this presentation, I'm primarily going to be focusing on The Children's Hour, which is a play by Lillian Hellman. So I wanted to provide a brief summary of The Children's Hour as context for those of you that are unfamiliar with this play. I chose to work with this play because it shows an instance in American literature in which sisterhood actually does exist between the two leading female characters, Martha and Karen. Martha and Karen established a school for girls with one another. In doing so, the women blatantly challenge patriarchal expectations in place for them as women. They are completely financially independent and therefore do not require husbands for financial security as patriarchy typically calls for. Instead, they depend more upon one another in this union of sisterhood for financial support than they do upon any male figure. They're also largely emotionally independent, relying upon one another more than any man for comfort, protection, and just overall contentedness. So characteristic of sisterhood then, the women are in all ways more reliant upon one another than they are upon males, showing their explicit opposition to patriarchy. They do not comply with the patriarchally determined expectations in place for them. So Mary, a student within Karen's and Martha's school, creates a false rumor telling her patriarchally socialized grandmother, Mrs. Tilford, that her teachers are engaging in a homosexual relationship. In portraying relationships of sisterhood as homosexuality rather than a tight homosocial bond, Mary effectively villainizes her teachers due to the stigma attached to homosexuality within American society. Her actions then shut down the sisterhood that once existed amongst the women, working to uphold and reassert the dominance of patriarchy. The consequences of this lie demonstrate the means to which people will go in order to maintain the patriarchal status quo, which homosexuality inherently opposes. Not only do the parents of the students withdraw their daughters from the school, causing its demise and then also the downfall of Karen's and Martha's careers, but society ostracizes and villainizes Karen and Martha for their alleged lesbianism. In this way, we see a tendency to exclude lesbians and non-heterosexual women from these movements for sisterhood. Lesbians are considered unnatural, as Martha's aunt states, and therefore they do not earn access into a safe zone of sisterhood. At the end of the play, Martha recognizes that she in fact does possess romantic feelings towards Karen. Understanding the societal implications of her own feelings, considering the ways in which she and Karen were treated on the mere supposition of their sexual orientation, Martha tragically decides to end her own life. And this reveals a very harmful notion that the only way to end the threat of lesbianism to patriarchy is through the death of one or both parties involved in the deviant, non-conforming relationship. So overall then, this play brings to our attention the lack of inclusion that lesbians and non-heterosexual women experience within movements for sisterhood, as they are villainized by fellow women within the context of the Children's Hour. Further, patriarchally socialized women, including Mrs. Mortar, Mrs. Tilford, and Mary, actively work to shut down the sisterhood that Karen and Martha experience due to the inherent threat such a relationship poses to the integrity of patriarchy. So The Children's Hour is based off of a real case that occurred in Edinburgh, Scotland. The plot of The Children's Hour very closely follows this case, so I'm not going to go into details. But Jane Peary and Marianne Woods are the two women who started the school. They're represented by Martha and Karen. And Jane Cumming is the girl who starts the lie, and she's represented by Mary then within the play. Notably, Jane Cumming is the illegitimate child of an Englishman and Indian woman, meaning that she occupies this space as a biracial woman. And that's something I would like you to keep in mind as we go through. So I wanted to take some time to discuss Mary's role within the Children's Hour because I think that her character and function within the play is very largely misunderstood. I argue that Mary's character represents the exclusionary nature of sisterhood within this play. Because she's embraced by neither female adults nor her peers, which is detrimental to her perception of sisterhood. Firstly, the women within the story, namely Karen and Martha, do not stand in a bond of sisterhood with Mary. They cast her as a troublemaker that is bad for the other students in her school. Karen and Martha largely exclude Mary from sisterhood on the grounds of her behavioral issues. Largely influenced by Karen and Martha, the girls attending the Wright Dobie School also openly dislike Mary, excluding her from their own bonds of sisterhood. In a scene in which Mary, while with some of her peers, breaks a gift given to Karen by her fiancé, one student tellingly says, "We didn't do it, you did it." This stark us versus them dichotomy is created through the student's words, and the student tellingly reveals the ways in which Mary is not one of the girls. She is omitted from the protection and security that sisterhood has to offer. Further, I should note that Hellman produces Mary's character as being racially ambiguous. So if we are to infer that Mary is heavily based off her real counterpart, Jane Cumming, we might assume that she too is biracial. And in this way, I claim that Hellman's play might tellingly reveal a severe flaw within American feminism. It basically works to fulfill the agendas of white heterosexual women, offering no solidarity to non-white, non-heterosexual women. So in this way, perhaps Mary's character serves as an expose of how white American women might have sisterhood, like Karen and Martha did, but it ultimately fails since they do not include non-white women, so in this case, Mary. So taking all of this into consideration then, I claim that Mary's character shows a cyclical effect produced by being excluded from sisterhood. Mary's excluded, so she naturally views it as a negative construct, something that's really just not for her. And since Mary views sisterhood as something detrimental and out to get her almost, she works to tear it down by using patriarchal means. She creates a patriarchally motivated lie that Karen and Martha are lesbians to stigmatize and criminalize the relationship between the two women. This is essentially Mary's way of seeking revenge upon the women for their sisterhood, since sisterhood failed to include and assist Mary throughout her own life. So by failing to include all women, Americans create a cycle of patriarchal oppression. We need sisterhood because it defies patriarchal oppression, but if we do not include all women in the movement, women might understandably utilize patriarchally motivated measures to attack the sisterhood that actively and harmfully oppresses them. So in conclusion, I contend that for sisterhood to succeed, American women need to include all women regardless of sexual orientation and or race. As a first step towards achieving greater gender equalities then, within society and therefore literature, since literature is a reflection of society in which it's produced, women must first establish bonds of sisterhood with one another, and only then can true change occur at a widespread societal level. Thank you.